It's hard to know who to trust in this world, and it's even harder when you're playing Among Us. No matter who the imposter is, the facts are always the facts. And good news, I've got 107 facts right here about Among Us. Number 1. Despite its massive success, Among Us was developed by a small indie studio based in Washington called Innersloth. Number 2. Innersloth itself was co-founded by Marcus Bromander and Forrest Willard. Number 3. If you spent any time on Newgrounds.com back in the day, you'll know Bromander better by his online handle, Puffballs United. Before Among Us and even Innersloth, Bromander was making games and cartoons on Newgrounds as far back as 2007. Number 4. Where Bromander is the artist, animator, and game designer of Innersloth, Willard is the computer programmer and head of business management. Number 5. While Willard wasn't making Newgrounds games himself before Innersloth, he was actually putting his technical skills to use as an employee for Microsoft. Number 6. Once Willard left his Microsoft gig, he and Bromander decided to go into business themselves. With Bromander's knowledge of game design and Willard's technical skills, they figured they'd be a great match for making video games. Number 7. And so, the two of them formed Innersloth in 2015. Number 8. It didn't take long for the two-man Innersloth to bring on their third member. Shortly after the company was formed, Bromander and Willard hired Amy Liu as an artist, designer, and animator for the new studio. Number 9. The three of them actually met in college. They all attended Oregon State University together. Number 10. It didn't take long for Innersloth to develop their first game, Dig to China. It was released in 2015, not long after the studio was founded. Number 11. In Dig to China, the player digs through 13 layers of Earth to reach, you guessed it, China. In other words, it shared just about zero qualities with Among Us. Number 12. After Dig to China, Innersloth dabbled in multiplayer games over the next few years. However, nothing stuck. The whole trial and error process almost turned Innersloth off from making multiplayer games altogether. Number 13. Up until October 2017, the members of Innersloth had been investing what extra time they had outside of their main jobs. Well, they finally decided to focus all of their energy into game development. Number 14. By November 2017, just 1 month later, the team had fully started development on their next project, Among Us, or at least the game that would become Among Us. Number 15. As far as development tools go, Innersloth decided to make Among Us using Unity. Number 16. From the earliest idea stages, Among Us was inspired by the social deduction game Mafia. Some people know it as Werewolf, but it's pretty much the same game. Number 17. As a game, Mafia has been around since the 80s. However, the version that Bromander played as a kid was a little different. In his own homebrewed Mafia game, players would each draw a role card and then aimlessly wander the house. Meanwhile, one person is in the Mafia and would kill players by drawing a finger across their neck. Number 18. When the other players would find the body, they would have to figure out which one of the survivors was in the Mafia. Does this game loop sound familiar? It inspired the core finding a body aspect of Among Us. Number 19. Initially, Innersloth thought of using the house model for Mafia instead of their digital version, but thought it would be boring. Making an interesting enough home to play around in would be too hard. Number 20. To keep things exciting, they ultimately went with the outer space theme for the game's setting. Number 21. Before the game was ever called Among Us, it was actually internally referred to as Space Mafia by the Innersloth devs. Number 22. Even after the game came out, on the Android version of Among Us, you can see the game's file name listed as Space Mafia. Also, on iOS and the Apple Store, Among Us's app ID was Space Mafia. Number 23. Social deduction games like Mafia had an obvious influence on Among Us, but one movie also made its mark. Innersloth was also inspired by John Carpenter's 1982 sci-fi horror classic, The Thing. Number 24. As if the outer space and Thing vibes weren't exciting enough, Innersloth also added tasks for the non-imposters to do. They believed that removing the wandering around element of Bromander's original game would be more engaging for players. Number 25. As for the tasks themselves, Innersloth toyed around with a number of different iterations on what players would do before settling on the final version. Number 26. In an early version of Among Us, the spaceship was in a kind of crisis, and the players were tasked with fixing the ship. Meanwhile, the imposter could sabotage their efforts by simply messing the tasks up. Number 27. Eventually, Innersloth axed the whole crisis element because it made the game too stressful. They wanted players to focus more on the detective work and the conversations instead of accomplishing the tasks themselves. Number 28. In terms of of scope, Among Us was planned to be a more modest, contained game. Even at launch, Among Us was originally only for mobile devices, multiplayer was only local, and just one map was available, the Skeld. Number 29. Bromander actually paused development on Innersloth's other game, the Henry Stickmin collection, to work on the Skeld. Number 30. According to Forrest Willard, playtesting Among Us was a huge pain in the ass. The game regularly broke down during play sessions, so he would constantly have to send testers new builds. Number 31. During testing, Innersloth would have 8 of their friends play the game. Just 8. Even though the game allowed for a maximum of 10 players, they never tested a full game. They didn't even try it with 9. Number 32. Well, after what must have been sufficient testing, Innersloth released Among Us on June 15, 2018 for both iOS and Android. Number 33. Shortly after release, Among Us's player base crept up to an average of 30 to 50 concurrent players. Number 34. The release itself wasn't exactly advertised. As Bromander explained, at the time, everyone on the team at Innersloth was really bad at marketing. Number 35. Sure, the starting player base was modest, but those that played loved it. This would regularly give Innersloth some much appreciated feedback. So over the next month, they added new tasks, customization options, and the much requested online multiplayer. Number 36. Also, Innersloth listened to their players' suggestions and ported Among Us to PC, throwing it up onto Steam on November 16, 2018. The PC port even supported cross-platform play with the mobile versions. Number 37. With the Steam release, Among Us also had some brand new sound effects. Willard put the new sound effects together by mixing a number of different SFX packs together. Number 38. Yeah, originally Among Us didn't have sound effects. Remember, it was originally only for local play, so Innersloth wanted to make sure that audio cues wouldn't give away who the imposter was in a local setting. Number 39. Innersloth's changes were much appreciated by the players. By December 2018, the user base had grown enough to be active 24/7. For Willard, that kind of active player base was good enough. Number 40. While the player base wasn't exactly impressive, Innersloth felt an obligation to the ones who were playing to keep updating and working on Among Us. Number 41. Willard admitted that at one point, Innersloth tried to quit working on Among Us, and that they should have quit several times. He described sticking with Among Us a bad business decision at the time. Number 42. The only reason Innersloth was even able to keep working on it was because they had enough money in the bank. Bromander and Willard both had some savings, and Willard still had some money stashed away since his last computer engineering job. Number 43. Sometimes Innersloth would update the game as regularly as once per week. It was hardly the most played game on Steam, so for Innersloth it was more a labor of love for the community that they'd built. Number 44. However, that community was steadily growing. With each update, new players would trickle in. According to Willard, that's the Innersloth process. He said, "We're a slow-growing company. We snowball our way to the top instead of spike and tail like most Steam releases do." Number 45. That's not to say that Among Us didn't see the occasional spike though. At one point, Among Us was picked up by a popular Korean content creator. Suddenly, the game was flooded with thousands of new players. Number 46. The influx of new players was great news, sure, but there was too much growth too quickly. At the time, Among Us was working off some free Amazon servers, so it was soon overloaded with the bigger player base. Number 47. At the time, the entire Innersloth team was still only 3 people, Bromander, Willard, and Liu. So fixing the new server problems required a good degree of crunch. Willard regularly worked 14-hour days, fixing everything that he possibly could as quickly as he possibly could. Number 48. Willard described these waves of popularity as bittersweet. When the game gets noticed, he said that that's where those 80-hour work weeks come in. However, he was determined to meet the challenge head-on, saying that if you don't react quickly in those moments, you lose them forever. Number 49. According to Bromander, those waves also pushed Innersloth to want to do more with the game, not just keep it from running off the rails. These new players were the shot in the arm that kept Innersloth from quitting. Number 50. So Innersloth kept chugging along. They released 2 maps in 2019, Mira HQ in August and the Research Station Polis in November. Number 51. Originally, each map went for $4, but the price was kicked down to $2 in January of 2020. Number 52. Of course, with new maps, there were new players. In 2019, Among Us received a big boost from a popular YouTuber in Brazil, growing the game's player base in that region as well. Number 53. By the time Among Us blew up in the United States in 2020, the game was already super popular in Korea, Brazil, and Mexico. Number 54. In August of 2019, Among Us hit the 1 million download milestone across all platforms. Number 55. Even after the massive surge of US players, Willard said that they played third fiddle to the numbers Among Us was doing in other regions. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Number 56. In January 2020, Innersloth announced that after about a year and a half, they were finally done working on Among Us. Moving forward, the team would be moving on to a new game. Number 57. What was that new game? Well, Among Us 2. In August 2020, Innersloth fully shifted focus to working on an Among Us sequel, and even announced that a sequel was in the works. Number 58. Just before Among Us 2 was announced, Innersloth had just finished and released another game, the Henry Stickmin Collection, a remastered collection of Bromander's old Newgrounds games, all in one package on Steam. Number 59. While all this was going down, the first Among Us was still getting some attention from Willard and Liu. Innersloth added 4 servers and 3 regions to accommodate the still growing player base. Number 60. Also, in August 2020, Innersloth opened their own online store for official Among Us merch. Number 61. So, while the player base for Among Us had already been growing in the US, things finally popped off around the middle of July 2020. Popular streamer SodaPoppin gave the game a shot during one of his Twitch streams, pulling tons of brand new eyes towards the game. Number 62. Willard even has a theory about why SodaPoppin even started playing Among Us. According to Willard, someone named Pluto worked with Twitch's partnership team. There was a daily deal on Steam, and Among Us went on sale as part of the deal. When Pluto heard about the game, he told SodaPoppin to try it, and the rest is history. Number 63. SodaPoppin would stream the game with another popular Twitch streamer, XQC. So 2 different large audiences put eyes on the game. They even streamed it with Andy Milanakis. Number 64. Depending on who SodaPoppin would bring onto his stream, Among Us would explode with whatever community the guest was associated with. For example, SodaPoppin plays Among Us with a League of Legends streamer. Now you've got tons of League players checking out Among Us. Rinse and repeat. Number 65. Sometimes Innersloth themselves would watch streamers just to see how people reacted to the game. Amy Liu would sometimes watch Spanish streamers, and even though she didn't understand just about a word of what they said, she could still tell that they were having a good time. Number 66. Willard had even tried reaching out to various streamers about the game earlier in 2020, but nothing ever came of it. Number 67. Streamers aside, we have to give credit where credit is due. One key contributor to Among Us's success was the COVID pandemic. With everyone still locked down and social distancing, Among Us was perfect for people stuck inside. Number 68. Despite having announced the sequel, with the new popularity of the OG game, Innersloth announced that the Among Us sequel was cancelled on September 23, 2020. Number 69. Thankfully, it's not like they threw out a whole bunch of work. The sequel was only in the very early planning stages, and no actual dev work had been done. Number 70. By then, Among Us had truly exploded. Innersloth said that the Twitch streaming blowup led to 50 times more sales of the game than any other event or deal in Among Us history. Number 71. From the Google Store alone, by September 3rd, Among Us had been downloaded more than 10 million times. By the 8th, more than 50 million. By the 21st, more than 100 million. Number 72. Now that their game was insanely popular, and with a sequel being a thing of the past, Innersloth went all in. They felt that Among Us was outdated, so they wanted to update the game so it could support new content. Number 73. Specifically, they set out to fix server issues, stop the rampant cheating, and create a system for players to ban other players that ruin the experience. Number 74. In the middle of October, Among Us was hit with a massive hack to their North American servers. A hacker by the name of Eris Loris had bots constantly spamming chat, promoting their YouTube channel, Discord server, and political views. Number 75. Eris Loris also threatened to hack and ruin other players' devices if they didn't subscribe to their YouTube channel. Number 76. Oh, and for the record, that Discord server that Eris Loris was linking contained all kinds of horrible stuff, everything from toxic racist comments and memes to pictures of gore and animal abuse. Number 77. Eris Loris, or at least someone posing as them, actually explained to Eurogamer that they created the spam bot in about 6 hours. They also asserted that they had about 50 other hackers helping them and had hacked 4.9 million players across 1.5 million games of Among Us. Number 78. Why go through all the trouble? Well, other than for the lols, their words not mine, Loris said that it was to push players to vote for Donald Trump in the 2020 election, a message that they pushed a lot in their bot spam. Number 79. Funny enough, that same month, Democratic Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar streamed Among Us together, featuring famous streamers like Pokimane and Hasanabi. They used the stream to promote the importance of voting, so all at once, Among Us was this bizarre forum for political discourse in a way. Number 80. As a response to the Eris Loris hack, Innersloth updated Among Us with an in-game message, warning of the hack, and the studio's intentions to release an emergency server update to counter the spam and hack. Number 81. Thankfully, the update seemed to work, though Eris Loris did briefly seem to resurface in January of 2021. This time, they were pushing their homebrewed Among Us cheats. Number 82. This hacking hiccup didn't slow the game down though. In October of 2020, Among Us was the most downloaded app on the iOS store. Not the most downloaded game, the most downloaded app. Number 83. At the Game Awards for 2020, Among Us actually won the Best Mobile Game and Best Multiplayer Game too. Number 84. With all of the success, it was only a matter of time until Among Us came to consoles. The game was released digitally on PS4, PS5, Xbox One, and Xbox Series S/X on December 14th, 2020, with crossplay between all versions. Number 85. Innersloth had actually wanted to go for PS4 and Xbox One ports earlier, but ran into trouble with making the text-based communication work. Consoles don't typically have keyboards, you know? At one point, they had even considered implementing a quick comm system like Rocket League. Number 86. That same day, Among Us was actually put into Xbox's Game Pass, while the PlayStation versions received exclusive Ratchet & Clank customization options. Number 87. The Nintendo Switch received its own Among Us port the very next day, on December 15th. It was announced during Nintendo's Indie World Direct. Number 88. Among Us quickly shot up to become one of the best-selling Switch games in the console's history, selling 3.2 million digital copies in just the last 2 weeks of December. Number 89. The Switch version actually came with its own accidental version exclusive bonus. Among Us players on Switch could use an exploit to access the upcoming map Airship well before its official release. Still, the fun only lasted for 2 days before Innersloth patched the exploit out with an update. Number 90. Airship was officially released as the 4th Among Us map on March 31st, 2021. The map itself is actually a reference to Innersloth's Henry Stickmin series. It's based on the Toppet clan Airship. Number 91. Also, Airship didn't cost $4 or even the discounted $2. Instead, Airship was free from the jump. The 2 other DLC maps had also been free since June 2020. Number 92. Although 2020 was a momentous year for Among Us, 2021 was no slouch. 1 week in May, the game was offered for free on the Epic Games Store. During this week, the average daily player count jumped from the 350,000 average of the previous few weeks to 2 million. Number 93. Innersloth themselves said that the promotion moved 15 million copies of the game on the Epic Games Store. Number 94. Not everything was so nice with Epic though. In August 2021, Fortnite actually developed and added a new game mode called Imposters. Number 95. Fortnite already had an Among Us inspired community-made game mode called the Spy Within. This mode had been around since December 2020 and featured players trying to earn coins while deducing who the imposter is. Number 96. Epic's homegrown official version was even closer to Among Us. Players would run around in an underground bunker with a suspiciously similar layout to Among Us's original map. Number 97. The resemblance was so striking that Innersloth even publicly commented on Imposters. Marcus Bromander himself said, "Is it really that hard to put 10% more effort into putting your own spin on it though?" Number 98. Thoroughly called out, Epic decided to play nice. In an October 2021 blog post, Epic made sure to specifically credit Innersloth and Among Us as inspirations for Fortnite's Imposters mode. Number 99. With things smoothed over, in June 2022, Innersloth and Epic collaborated. Fortnite added an Among Us crewmate as a back bling, complete with customizable colors. Number 100. Even Henry Stickmin got some love. Fortnite also added his distraction dance to the list of emotes to buy from the store. Number 101. Fortnite was hardly the only Among Us collab. The first official crossover was with a fellow out of the Blue success story, Fall Guys. They added an Among Us skin for their characters. Number 102. Among Us characters even pop up a number of times in other video games, including fellow indie games like A Hat in Time and Astroneer. Number 103. Of course, Among Us has outside references as well. Aside from Ratchet & Clank, they've also included customizables from Riot Games' Arcane, Halo, and Scream. Number 104. Among Us even got its own manga. On February 28, 2022, the Japanese magazine Besatu Korokoro published a one-shot Among Us manga for its April issue. Number 105. You don't even have to play Among Us to feel its presence. It's everywhere. In September 2020, YouTube reported 4 billion views on Among Us related videos alone. Number 106. Just a month later, in October 2020, TikTok reported an even wilder 13 billion views on Among Us related content. Number 107. Also, let the record show that Among Us did not invent the word sus. However, it is entirely to blame or celebrate for Merriam-Webster's decision to add sus to its dictionary in September of 2022. Looking up sus in the dictionary, I found a different word close by: subscribe. To receive or have access to something as part of an arrangement to receive a certain number of regular deliverances or a certain period of continuous access. Used in a sentence, subscribe to the Leaderboard for more 107 Facts videos.